Imagine waking up not to the familiar hum of modern life, but to the quiet rustle of silk curtains in a candlelit chamber, where the first light of dawn creeps across polished mahogany floors, and the weight of the day ahead presses upon you before you have even risen. Picture yourself stepping into a grand assembly room filled with the soft murmur of voices and the faint scent of beeswax and lavender, only to realize in that single, suspended moment that your gloves are the wrong shade of ivory, or that you have offered your hand to the wrong partner in the opening set. Whispers ripple outward like ripples on still water. Heads turn with measured disapproval, and suddenly the evening you had anticipated with such careful hope dissolves into a quiet exile at the edge of the dance floor, your name already travelling through drawing rooms the next morning as a cautionary tale. Such moments were not rare inventions of fiction, but the very fabric of daily existence during the Regency Era. That brief yet intensely scrutinised stretch of years from 1811 to 1820, when King George III's illness placed his son in temporary rule, and British society tightened its invisible cords of conduct until even the smallest gesture could determine a lifetime of acceptance or exclusion. In those 2 decades, the old certainties of the 18th century had begun to fray under the pressures of war, industrial change, and the rising influence of the middle classes. Yet the aristocracy and gentry responded not by loosening their standards, but by sharpening them into an ever more intricate code. Etiquette became both shield and weapon, a language spoken without words that separated the truly refined from those who merely aspired. The rules covered every hour from the moment one opened one's eyes until the final candle was snuffed at night, and they carried a psychological weight that modern minds can scarcely picture. One misstep at a morning call might close the doors of an entire social circle. A single improper phrase in a ballroom could shadow a young woman's prospects for years. What makes these conventions so absorbing to consider now is their sheer abundance and, often, their quiet absurdity. The way they transformed ordinary human interactions into performances requiring constant vigilance. You might find yourself wondering, as the night deepens around you, how people navigated such a minefield without constant exhaustion, or whether anyone ever dared to bend a rule in private only to be caught by an observant neighbour. The answers lie scattered through letters, novels and conduct manuals of the period, revealing a world in which politeness was never merely polite, but a precise calibration of rank, gender and circumstance. Over the coming passages we will wander through the most delicate of these customs, from the rigid expectations of social hierarchy that dictated who could even speak first, to the peculiar rituals of morning visits that turned simple courtesy into an elaborate chess game of timing and duration. We will pause at the edge of the ballroom, where every glance and every step was freighted with meaning, and linger over the dining table where the placement of a fork or the direction of a conversation could invite either favour or quiet ruin. Courtship itself unfolded under relentless observation, conducted through the silent vocabulary of fans and gloves, whose colours and positions conveyed messages more eloquent than speech. Even grief followed its own exhausting timetable, while the formalities of being presented at court or walking in public parks demanded an awareness of posture and precedence that left little room for spontaneity. Correspondence, too, became a nightly trial of phrasing and sealing, and country house parties required an almost military precision in the arrangement of guests and activities. Each of these arenas carried its own catalogue of possible disasters, yet they all sprang from the same deep need to preserve order in a society that felt itself perpetually on the verge of change. The rules existed not merely to inconvenience, but to reinforce boundaries that were already beginning to shift, offering those who mastered them a sense of belonging while quietly punishing those who could not or would not conform. As we explore them together, notice how often the most trivial detail, an ungloved hand offered too soon, a letter left unsealed, a bonnet worn at the wrong angle, carried consequences far beyond its surface, revealing the intense human desire for certainty in uncertain times. If you're listening now, perhaps in the stillness of late evening or the small hours before dawn, I would be grateful if you would pause for a moment and share in the comments where you are and what time it happens to be for you. It is always interesting to feel connected across the globe and to picture the many quiet rooms in which these stories are unfolding at once, each listener wrapped in their own pocket of night, yet joined by the same thread of curiosity about lives lived long ago under very different skies. Such reflections invite us to consider the Regency not as a distant pageant, but as a mirror held up to our own unspoken codes of behaviour, the modern equivalents we follow without always naming them. The era's etiquette manuals sold briskly precisely because they promised security in a world where reputation was the only reliable currency, and the fear of losing that currency could turn even the most confident person into a careful student of minutiae. One can imagine the quiet satisfaction of mastering the correct depth of a curtsy, or the precise length of time one might remain at a dinner before rising, yet also the private dread that accompanied every public appearance. These tensions, rather than diminishing over the decades, seemed only to intensify as the period drew toward its close, leaving behind a legacy of conduct that later generations would both admire and gently mock. By tracing the outlines of these customs, we begin to sense the texture of Regency life itself. The rustle of heavy skirts in narrow corridors, the careful choreography of servants moving through candle-lit rooms, the unspoken calculations that accompanied every introduction, the psychological toll of maintaining such standards day after day is perhaps the most intriguing element of all, for it suggests that beneath the surface elegance ran a current of constant self-monitoring that could drain even the most practiced participant. Yet the same rules that exhausted also protected, creating small islands of predictability in an age when larger political and economic storms were never far away. As we move forward into the specific arenas where these pressures played out most visibly, the picture grows richer and more curious, each detail adding another layer to the portrait of a society that asked its members to live as though every gesture were being watched, because more often than not, it truly was. At the very foundation of every glance, every bow, and every carefully measured word lay the peerage itself, that ancient ladder of titles whose rung seemed fixed by divine right, yet trembled ever so slightly under the pressures of war fortunes and unexpected inheritances. One could picture a newcomer stepping into a candlelit drawing room and feeling, before a single syllable was spoken, the invisible architecture of rank arranging everyone present into their precise stations, dukes and marquesses occupying the highest elevations, earls and viscounts arrayed just below, barons forming the lowest tier of true nobility, while the gentry of baronets and knights hovered in that ambiguous space where ancient lineage met newer wealth without ever quite securing the same deference. Birth alone determined which of these spheres one might inhabit, shaping not only the size of one's estate or the cut of one's coat, but the entire constellation of possible acquaintances, the schools one attended, the parishes one supported, and the marriages one might reasonably contemplate without inviting scandal or outright refusal. In this world, a daughter of a viscount understood from childhood that her circle would rarely overlap with that of a prosperous merchant's child, however cultivated the latter might be, because the boundaries were enforced less by law than by the quiet consensus of who received the first invitation and who was left to call at the side door. Historians have sometimes wondered whether these divisions ever softened in the privacy of country estates, where shared interests in hunting or music might blur the lines for an afternoon. Yet the surviving letters suggest that even the most affable host remained acutely aware of who could be addressed without a formal introduction, and who required the mediation of a mutual connection. The peerage system itself carried its own internal gradations that outsiders found bewildering. An earl's younger son ranked below his elder brother, yet above most baronets, while the daughters of dukes enjoyed the style of lady even after marriage to commoners, a privilege that could create delicate imbalances at any gathering where precedents dictated the order of entering a room or the depth of a curtsy offered in return. Such distinctions demanded an almost instinctive fluency in the language of address, where a misplaced "Your Grace" or an insufficiently deferential "Sir" could reveal in an instant that the speaker had not been raised within the correct sphere. One addressed a duke or duchess as "Your Grace," an earl or countess as "Lord" or "Lady," followed by the family name, a baron as "Lord" in the same manner, yet the daughters of viscounts and barons received only the honorific "the Honourable," a subtle reminder that their rank, though noble, stopped short of the higher coronets. Among the gentry the rules shifted again, with baronets styled "Sir" and their wives "Lady," while untitled gentlemen and their families remained simply "Mr." or "Miss," distinctions that mattered intensely because they signalled exactly how much familiarity one might claim without presumption. A young woman of good family might spend years practising these forms in the schoolroom, reciting them until they became second nature. Yet even then the possibility remained that an unexpected encounter with a recently elevated peer, or an Irish title whose usage differed slightly, could trip the tongue and expose the speaker to that faint but unmistakable chill of corrected presumption. The consequences of such confusion extended far beyond momentary embarrassment, for a single misaddressed remark could ripple outward through the narrow channels of Regency society, closing drawing-room doors that had once stood ajar and altering the trajectory of invitations, recommendations, and ultimately marriages that secured or diminished entire family fortunes. Letters of the period occasionally hint at the quiet devastation felt by those who realized too late that they had spoken too freely to someone whose station required greater reserve, or conversely had maintained an overly formal distance with a person whose goodwill might have eased their path into more exclusive circles. In an age when reputation functioned as the principal currency, these small errors of protocol carried the weight of lasting verdicts, suggesting not merely ignorance of etiquette, but a deeper failure to comprehend the natural order of things. One can imagine the anxious rehearsal that preceded every new introduction, the mental tally of titles and styles performed silently, while waiting for the moment when names were exchanged and the correct form of address had to emerge without hesitation or apology. Yet the rigidity of this hierarchy also created its own curious compensations, pockets of predictability in which individuals knew precisely where they stood and could therefore navigate the most elaborate gatherings with a measure of assurance unavailable to those whose positions remained fluid or recently acquired. The very fact that birth fixed one's social universe meant that certain anxieties of modern mobility, the fear of rising or falling through effort or misfortune, were replaced by other, more static pressures. The duty to uphold the dignity of one's rank, the obligation to marry within acceptable limits, the constant awareness that one's children would inherit the same fixed place and therefore the same constraints. Conduct manuals of the era sometimes presented these arrangements as harmonious and benevolent, yet the private correspondence of those who lived within them often reveals moments of wistful reflection on what might have been possible had rank counted for less, and personal inclination for more. Such reflections remained largely unspoken in public, of course, for to question the hierarchy openly was itself a breach of the very code that preserved it. As the evening conversations lengthened and the candles burned lower, the awareness of these invisible gradations coloured every exchange, turning even the simplest request for a cup of tea into a miniature performance of deference or authority. A baron's wife addressing a duchess would modulate her tone and posture with an exactitude that left little room for spontaneous warmth, while the same woman speaking to a neighbouring squire's daughter might permit a slightly greater degree of ease, always calibrated so that no one mistook the temporary friendliness for an invitation to greater intimacy. The psychological texture of living inside such a system invites contemplation now, because it suggests that the elaborate etiquette rules explored in later passages sprang directly from this foundational need to mark and maintain distinctions at every turn. One misstep in a dress could therefore serve as the opening note in a longer symphony of exclusion, its echoes reaching drawing rooms miles away before the week was out. In this light, the peerage ceases to appear merely decorative and becomes instead the essential grammar through which all subsequent social performances were passed. The structure that made morning calls, ballroom encounters, and even the silent language of fans and gloves legible to those who had been raised within its bounds. The fascination lies not only in the precision of the rankings themselves, but in the human effort required to sustain them, the daily vigilance that transformed an accident of birth into an entire lived reality of expectation and restraint. As we turn next toward the rituals of visiting hours and the delicate negotiations they entailed, we begin to see how this hierarchy shaped the most ordinary rhythms of the day, turning the act of leaving one's card into another arena, where station had to be acknowledged before any genuine conversation could begin. In the measured cadence of a Regency day, the hours set aside for paying calls occupied a curious middle ground between the private rituals of the morning toilette and the more public spectacles of evening assemblies, a window whose precise boundaries shifted according to season, fashion, and the unspoken expectations of whichever circle one hoped to enter. One might picture a young woman of the gentry, rising early enough to oversee household accounts, yet forbidden by custom from venturing abroad until the clocks had advanced well past noon, for to appear at another's door before the accepted hour risked being mistaken for either a tradesman or an importunate relative seeking favours rather than conversation. Historians note that the term morning call itself concealed a gentle fiction, since these visits typically unfolded between the hours of 2 and 5 in the afternoon, a span that allowed hostesses to receive guests while still preserving the later evening for more formal entertainments. Any deviation from this interval invited speculation about the caller's motives or social training, and letters of the period occasionally record the quiet mortification of arriving at a house whose shutters remained closed, or whose servants delivered the polite but unmistakable message that the family was not at home. The question of who might call upon whom followed the same invisible architecture of rank already traced through titles and forms of address, so that a baronet's wife could with reasonable confidence present herself at the residence of a viscountess, provided a prior introduction had smoothed the way, whereas a prosperous merchant's daughter, however well connected through business, would find the same threshold closed unless she accompanied a mutual acquaintance of unimpeachable standing. Within these constraints further gradations appeared. A dowager countess might receive the daughters of earls and the wives of neighbouring landowners on the same afternoon, yet she would expect the former to be ushered into the drawing-room ahead of the latter, their cards sorted by precedence before any servant announced the names. The possibility of crossing these lines even accidentally fascinated contemporaries and continues to invite reflection today, for the surviving etiquette manuals hint that an ambitious family might attempt to enlarge its circle by calling upon someone marginally higher in station, banking on the hope that shared interests in music or philanthropy would outweigh the initial presumption. Whether such experiments succeeded depended less on written rules than on the temperament of the hostess and the discretion with which the visit was conducted. Central to every such negotiation stood the small rectangle of pasteboard known as the calling card, an object whose dimensions, engraving, and manner of presentation carried meanings as precise as any spoken phrase. A gentleman left his card alone when paying respects to another gentleman, or when the lady of the house was not receiving. Yet when calling upon a family he might turn down one corner to indicate that his wife or daughter accompanied him in spirit if not in person. A lady, for her part, might leave cards for each adult member of the household she wished to honour, stacking them in a small silver tray near the door so that the recipient could later decipher the exact degree of intimacy being offered or sought. The ritual extended further when a visitor wished to signal that no return call was expected, in which case the card might be left without the hostess's own card being requested in exchange, a subtlety that allowed distant cousins or newly arrived neighbours to pay their respects without committing either party to further obligation. One can imagine the quiet calculation performed by a servant sorting these cards each evening, arranging them not merely by name but by the folded corners and the order in which they had been presented, thereby furnishing the household with an informal ledger of social debts and possibilities that would shape invitations for weeks to come. Should the timing prove inopportune, the consequences unfolded with a quiet finality that could ripple outward through the narrow channels of acquaintance, arriving before the accepted hour might find the family still at breakfast, the drawing-room unprepared, and the caller obliged to wait in an anteroom while hurried messages passed between maid and mistress. Arriving after the hour, conversely, risked discovering that the hostess had already departed for another engagement, or, more pointedly, had instructed her servants to deny entry to all but the most intimate circle. In either case, the incident became a datum in the collective memory of the neighbourhood, for servants talked among themselves and letters carried the news to country houses where the same families would meet again during the hunting season. Contemporary accounts suggest that some hostesses deliberately varied their receiving hours from week to week, partly to discourage the merely curious, and partly to test which callers possessed the social intelligence to inquire discreetly beforehand. Such variations added an element of unpredictability that kept the practice from hardening into mere routine, yet they also placed an additional burden on those whose rank or recent arrival left them uncertain of the correct approach. The deeper fascination of these rituals lies in the way they translated the abstract gradations of peerage into the tangible movements of a single afternoon, turning the simple act of crossing a threshold into a performance whose every gesture acknowledged the hierarchy without ever naming it aloud. A caller who understood the unspoken calendar might time her visit to coincide with a day when the hostess had declared herself at home, thereby gaining not only admission, but the chance to encounter others of comparable station, and perhaps secure an introduction that would open still further doors. Those less attuned to these rhythms found themselves either turned away or received with a coolness that conveyed, without explicit rebuke, that their presence had been noted yet not entirely welcomed. Private correspondence occasionally captures the quiet anxiety that preceded such visits. The rehearsal of names and titles, the decision of whether to leave one card or three, the calculation of how long to remain before the conversation flagged, and departure became another delicate manoeuvre. In this light, the morning call emerges not as a quaint social custom, but as one of the principal mechanisms through which Regency society continually renewed and adjusted its boundaries, ensuring that even the most ordinary hours of the day remained saturated with the same attention to rank that governed ballrooms and dining tables alike. As these visits concluded, and the cards accumulated in their silver trays, the stage was set for the more public contests of the evening assembly, where the same principles of precedence would be tested under brighter lights and before a larger audience. As the calling cards settled into their silver trays and the afternoon light faded into the measured hush of early evening, the social theatre shifted from the discreet negotiations of the drawing-room to the more luminous and unforgiving arena of the assembly rooms. There, beneath chandeliers whose candlelight caught every flicker of expression, the principles of rank and precedence that had governed the morning calls found their most concentrated expression on the dance floor itself. What appeared at first glance a graceful diversion, an evening of quadrilles, country dances, and the occasional waltz permitted only under the strictest supervision, revealed itself upon closer acquaintance as a field of quiet combat, where a single misstep could echo through weeks of subsequent invitations or exclusions. Historians have long observed that balls served not merely as entertainment, but as public stages on which families displayed their alliances, tested their daughters' prospects, and occasionally risked the very reputations they sought to advance, all within the space of a few hours, whose rhythms were dictated as much by unspoken codes as by the music itself. The dance card, that slender booklet or ivory tablet suspended from a lady's wrist by a ribbon, encapsulated these tensions with particular clarity. Far from a simple list of partners, it functioned as a visible ledger of social capital, each penciled name recording not only an upcoming set but the degree of favour or obligation the lady extended or accepted. A gentleman seeking a place on the card might approach with a bow whose depth acknowledged the lady's rank relative to his own, yet the act of signing carried implications that rippled outward. Securing the first or last dance with a young woman of higher station could signal serious intent, while filling multiple lines risked the appearance of monopolizing her attention and thereby discouraging other suitors. Conversely, a card left largely blank invited speculation about the bearer's standing or appeal, prompting discreet inquiries among the chaperones ranged along the walls. Contemporary letters occasionally record the quiet calculations performed by mothers and aunts who scanned neighbouring cards during intervals, noting which names appeared repeatedly and which absences spoke volumes without a word being exchanged. In this way, the seemingly innocent exchange of a pencil became a mechanism for mapping the evening's shifting alliances, one whose outcomes would be discussed the following morning over breakfast tables and in the correspondence that followed the season's end. Rules governing acceptance or refusal added another layer of precision to these exchanges, their observance demanding a poise that belied the underlying stakes. A lady was generally expected to accept any partner who requested a dance, provided her card was not already engaged for that set, a convention rooted in the understanding that public refusal without compelling cause amounted to a slight that could not easily be retracted. Yet the manner of acceptance mattered equally. Too eager a response might suggest forwardness, while a hesitation that lasted a moment too long could wound the suitor's pride and invite retaliation in the form of whispered commentary among his circle. Declining gracefully required an artful phrasing, "I am already promised for this dance, sir, though I should be honoured another time," that preserved the gentleman's dignity without committing the lady to future obligation. Refusals extended too freely, however, risk the perception that the lady considered herself above her company, a judgment that could close doors at subsequent gatherings. Gentlemen, for their part, navigated parallel constraints. For once, a request had been voiced. It could not lightly be withdrawn without appearing capricious, and the pressure to fill a card evenly across ranks sometimes compelled them to seek partners whose conversation or connections offered little personal reward. These negotiations unfolded under the watchful eyes of matrons whose own youthful experiences lent them an acute sensitivity to the smallest deviations from form, ensuring that even the briefest exchange carried the weight of collective scrutiny. The potential for disaster multiplied when a dancer found herself paired with the wrong partner, an occurrence whose consequences extended well beyond the duration of a single set. Dancing twice in succession with the same gentleman, for instance, could be interpreted by onlookers as evidence of an understanding that had not yet received familial sanction, prompting letters of inquiry or, in more delicate cases, the discreet intervention of a chaperone who might suggest an intervening glass of lemonade. Equally hazardous was accepting the hand of someone whose reputation carried even a hint of scandal, a younger son known for gaming debts perhaps, or a widow whose mourning period had ended only recently, since proximity on the floor implied a tolerance that society might later invoke against both parties. Rank added its own complications. A merchant's daughter elevated by recent wealth might find herself claimed by an impoverished baronet, whose title offered social advancement, yet whose conversation revealed expectations of deference she was unaccustomed to extending. In such moments, the music itself seemed to underscore the mismatch, each turn of the dance bringing the pair into closer alignment, while the surrounding assembly weighed the implications with practiced detachment. Private diaries from the period preserve accounts of evenings derailed by precisely these miscalculations, where a single ill-considered set left the participant navigating a diminished circle of invitations for the remainder of the season, the memory of the misstep preserved in the collective recollection long after the candles had been extinguished. One might picture the assembly room at the height of the evening, the air warmed by the press of bodies and the scent of beeswax and orange blossom, as couples formed and reformed in patterns whose geometric precision masked the human calculations beneath. A young woman whose card filled early could move through the sets with the confidence of acknowledged favour, yet even she remained alert to the risk that an unexpected request from a superior connection might force the displacement of a prior engagement, requiring a swift and tactful renegotiation conducted in lowered tones at the edge of the floor. Those less fortunate, whose cards remained sparsely marked, found themselves observing from the margins, their presence a reminder that visibility alone did not guarantee participation, and that the same hierarchy governing morning calls continued to shape who stepped forward when the music began. The waltz, when permitted at all, introduced further variables, its closer hold demanding an additional layer of consent from chaperones, and heightening the sense that each rotation tested boundaries of propriety already stretched thin by the evening's accumulated glances and half-heard remarks. These dynamics gained intensity from the knowledge that the ballroom's verdicts travelled swiftly beyond its walls. A favourable pairing might prompt a hostess to extend an invitation to a subsequent dinner, while an awkward refusal could surface weeks later in the form of a cool greeting at the theatre or a pointed omission from a country house list. The very architecture of the assembly rooms reinforced this awareness, with their mirrored walls multiplying every gesture and their rows of seated observers ensuring that no exchange escaped notice. In quieter moments between dances, when the orchestra paused and conversation rose in a low murmur, participants could sense the collective assessment forming, an intangible ledger updated in real time that would determine not only the remainder of the season, but the longer arc of marriages, inheritances, and social mobility that depended upon these fragile public performances. Thus the evening assembly, far from a mere respite from the day's earlier rituals, emerged as their logical extension and most exacting test, where the same attention to precedents that had sorted calling cards now dictated the sequence of steps across a polished floor whose every measure carried consequences that lingered long after the final bow. As the final measures of the dance faded and the assembly rooms began to empty into the cooler night air, the company often repaired to adjoining supper rooms or, in the case of private entertainments, to the more intimate yet no less treacherous setting of the dining table itself. Here the same principles of precedence that had ordered the ballroom found fresh expression in arrangements whose apparent formality masked an array of potential missteps, each one capable of reshaping reputations with a single, misplaced gesture or ill-timed remark. Historians examining period correspondence have noted how often the transition from dance to meal marked a subtle intensification of scrutiny, as the fluid movement of the floor gave way to the fixed positions of the table, where every diner's placement relative to host, hostess, and titled guests became a visible map of favour or exclusion. A young woman who had navigated her dance card with grace might discover upon entering the dining room that her assigned seat placed her between two gentlemen whose conversational expectations differed sharply from those of the ballroom, or worse, that an error in the seating plan itself had displaced someone of higher rank and thereby invited whispered commentary that would circulate long after the meal concluded. The nightmare of seating arrangements stemmed in part from the intricate calculus of rank that hosts were expected to apply without the aid of written lists or modern place cards in many households, relying instead on memory and quick assessment at the moment guests assembled. A baronet's wife might reasonably claim precedence over a merchant's daughter of greater wealth, yet the presence of a visiting earl's sister could upend the entire order, forcing last-minute adjustments that risked offending those whose claims had been overlooked. Contemporary letters occasionally preserve accounts of dinners delayed, while a flustered hostess recalculated positions, the delay itself becoming a topic of later discussion among those who interpreted it as evidence of uncertain social footing. Once seated, moreover, the placement dictated not only conversation partners, but also the sequence in which dishes would be offered, so that proximity to the head of the table conferred both honour and the burden of initiating certain topics while avoiding others that might appear too forward. A guest seated too far down might find herself receiving portions only after they had cooled or diminished, an outcome that could be read as commentary on her standing and that left little recourse beyond a composed acceptance of whatever arrived. Table manners added further layers of complexity, their observance demanding a level of bodily control that belied the convivial atmosphere the meal was meant to project. One was expected to eat with measured slowness, neither rushing ahead of companions nor lingering so long over a single dish that the table's rhythm faltered, yet the precise boundary between these extremes remained a matter of unspoken calibration rather than fixed rule. Utensils had to be handled without clinking, knives never lifted to the mouth, and the fork employed in ways that avoided the appearance of stabbing or shoveling. Any deviation invited the silent judgment of those across the table, whose own training had rendered such gestures automatic. Historians have suggested that these conventions functioned partly as class markers, distinguishing those whose upbringing included daily rehearsal from those whose recent elevation left them navigating unfamiliar terrain, and period diaries record instances in which a single awkward reach across a neighbour's plate was later cited as reason to omit the offender from subsequent invitations. Silence during certain courses was likewise prescribed in some circles, not as absolute prohibition but as a preference that allowed the flavours to be appreciated without the distraction of chatter. Yet the moment when conversation might safely resume remained another point of potential misjudgment, with too early a remark risking the label of garrulous, and too late an entry suggesting disengagement. Rules governing what one could and could not eat introduced an additional dimension of hazard, particularly in households where the menu reflected both seasonal availability and the host's desire to display refinement through unfamiliar or elaborately prepared dishes. A guest was generally discouraged from refusing a dish offered directly by the host or hostess, since such refusal could be construed as criticism of the table's quality. Yet accepting every offering risked the appearance of gluttony, or, in the case of richer preparations, of overindulgence that might later be remarked upon in private correspondence. Certain foods carried their own associations. Shellfish, for instance, might be viewed as appropriate only in specific seasons or settings, while highly spiced preparations could test the composure of those unaccustomed to them, the slightest cough or reach for water becoming a focal point for neighbouring observation. Contemporary accounts occasionally describe the quiet calculations performed by diners weighing whether to accept a second helping of a favoured dish, knowing that eagerness might signal a lack of restraint while excessive modesty could be read as false delicacy. In this atmosphere, even the act of leaving food on the plate required finesse, for clearing one's plate too thoroughly might suggest hunger bordering on desperation, while leaving too much invited speculation about fastidiousness or poor appetite. The politics of serving and being served amplified these pressures, transforming what might have seemed a straightforward domestic process into a sequence of negotiations conducted through glances and subtle gestures. Servants moved according to hierarchies of their own, presenting dishes first to the highest-ranking guest and proceeding downward, so that any interruption in this order, whether through a misstep by a footman or an unexpected request from a lower-ranking diner, could ripple outward as evidence of household disarray or guest presumption. A lady wishing for a particular sauce or vegetable might signal her desire only through the lightest inclination of the head, never by direct address to the servant or by stretching across the table, and the failure of such a signal to be noticed could leave her without recourse short of enduring the remainder of the course in silence. Gentlemen faced parallel constraints when carving or passing shared dishes, their actions scrutinized for both competence and generosity. Offering too little might appear stingy, while serving oneself generously before others had been helped risked the charge of selfishness. Period letters preserve examples of dinners remembered less for their culinary merits than for the small breaches in serving etiquette that occurred, each one noted and later discussed among those who had witnessed the lapse, thereby extending the consequences of the evening far beyond the table itself. One might picture the dining room at the height of such an occasion, candlelight glinting on polished silver and the air carrying mingled scents of roasted meats, steamed vegetables, and the faint perfume of the guests, as each participant balanced the demands of appetite against the constant awareness of being observed. A misplaced fork or an ill-judged request for salt could become the subject of after-dinner conversation in other households, its details embroidered with each retelling until the original incident acquired the weight of character judgment. Yet the very density of these rules also created space for those who had mastered them to demonstrate quiet assurance, their ease at table serving as further evidence of suitability for the alliances the evening was meant to advance. The supper that followed a ball in particular often extended these dynamics into the small hours, with the informality of the late meal paradoxically heightening rather than relaxing the need for vigilance, since fatigue could loosen the very restraints that daytime decorum had enforced. In this way, the dining table, far from a mere interlude between dances and departures, emerged as another arena in which the same attention to precedence and performance that had shaped the evening's earlier movements continued to determine whose invitations would be renewed and whose prospects would quietly recede. As the candles burned lower in the supper rooms and the last carriages rattled away into the night, the same watchful eyes that had tracked every seating arrangement and every reach for a dish turned their attention, with renewed intensity, toward the quieter yet far more consequential matter of romantic attachment. Courtship in the Regency period unfolded as an elaborate and tightly choreographed performance, one in which every glance, every word, and every small token carried implications that extended well beyond the individuals involved. Historians working with surviving letters and diaries have observed how frequently these pursuits were conducted not in private, but under layers of formal and informal surveillance, turning what might have been moments of genuine feeling into exercises in calculated restraint. A young woman returning from the assembly might find herself replaying a single dance or a brief exchange at table, weighing whether the gentleman's choice of topic had signalled interest or merely politeness, while knowing that any misreading could expose her to ridicule or worse, to the label of forwardness that followed a reputation for years. The acceptable paths for expressing romantic interest remained narrow and indirect. A gentleman could request a second dance only if the young lady had not already been claimed for every set. Yet even this courtesy invited comment if it occurred too early in the evening or too often across successive gatherings. Conversation during these dances or at supper was expected to remain light, touching on neutral topics such as the weather, the music, or the latest novel, while any drift toward personal admiration risked crossing into impropriety. Period accounts suggest that some couples developed a private language of slight variations in phrasing or emphasis, allowing a compliment on a lady's performance at the pianoforte to carry an additional layer of meaning that only the intended recipient would fully register. Yet such subtleties depended on shared understanding and carried the constant hazard that an outsider might interpret them differently, transforming a private signal into public speculation. In households where marriage settlements could determine the financial security of entire families, these small exchanges were rarely left unexamined. Rules governing correspondence added another barrier to direct expression. A young woman could not write to a gentleman without the explicit knowledge and often the supervision of her parents or guardians, and even then the letter had to be composed with an awareness that it might later be read aloud or passed among relatives. Gentlemen faced parallel restrictions. Unsolicited letters risked being returned unopened or, if accepted, becoming evidence of presumption that could damage both parties' standing. Gifts followed similar constraints. Small tokens such as a pressed flower or a shared volume of poetry might be offered after a prolonged acquaintance, yet only if they could be framed as tokens of general esteem rather than personal attachment. More substantial presents, particularly items of jewellery or clothing, were generally reserved for engaged couples, and even then required careful negotiation through family intermediaries. Contemporary observers noted that the line between acceptable and excessive generosity often shifted with the rank and wealth of the families involved, leaving room for interpretation that could either protect or expose the participants, depending on how the gesture was later recounted. Chaperones formed the most visible and unyielding element of this surveillance. Whether at a ball, during a morning call, or on a drive through the park, an unmarried woman of respectable station was rarely permitted to be alone with a potential suitor for more than a few minutes. The chaperone might be a mother, an older married sister, or even a paid companion, but her presence was understood to be continuous and attentive. Some families employed servants specifically tasked with reporting any deviation from expected conduct, while others relied on the natural circulation of visitors in a drawing room or the open doors of a carriage. Historians have suggested that this system served multiple purposes, protecting young women from scandal in an era when a single rumour could close off marriage prospects, while also allowing families to monitor alliances that carried economic weight. At the same time, the constant presence created its own tensions, as couples learned to convey meaning through half-finished sentences or shared glances over the top of an embroidery frame, gestures that could be missed or misinterpreted by the very person meant to oversee them. Public outings introduced further complications. A walk in a garden or along a promenade required not only a chaperone, but also the maintenance of a measured distance, and a pace that avoided any appearance of haste or intimacy. Carriage rides demanded open vehicles or the presence of additional passengers, and even then the conversation was expected to remain audible to those nearby. In country houses during extended visits, the opportunities for private talk multiplied, yet so did the risks, as corridors, libraries and conservatories became sites of heightened observation by both family members and servants whose discretion could not always be guaranteed. Letters exchanged under such conditions sometimes reveal the strain of these arrangements, with writers lamenting the impossibility of completing a thought before interruption, or of receiving a reply without it passing through several hands. When courtship deviated from these expectations, the consequences could extend far beyond personal disappointment. A broken engagement, particularly if announced after gifts had been exchanged or announcements circulated, invited gossip that questioned the character of both parties. Elopements, though romanticised in fiction, often resulted in social ostracism unless the families could be reconciled quickly through settlement negotiations. More commonly, an ill-judged letter discovered by a sibling or a servant, or a single unchaperoned moment observed by an acquaintance, could circulate through correspondence networks and drawing-room conversations until the young woman found herself excluded from certain invitations or viewed with caution by potential suitors. Gentlemen faced their own vulnerabilities. A reputation for trifling with affections or for pressing an advantage too openly could limit access to the very circles in which suitable matches were made. Period diaries occasionally preserve accounts of families that quietly removed a daughter from town for a season, or redirected a son to military or diplomatic postings abroad, actions that allowed time for rumours to subside without ever being openly discussed. Yet within these constraints existed small spaces where genuine attachment could develop and be recognised. A chaperone who had once navigated similar waters might choose to look away at a decisive moment, or a family might interpret a prolonged correspondence as evidence of compatibility rather than impropriety. The very density of the rules meant that those who mastered them could signal steadiness and good judgment, qualities valued in the marriage market. Historians continue to debate the extent to which these mechanisms protected vulnerable individuals or simply reinforced existing hierarchies of class and gender, with surviving evidence supporting both interpretations depending on the particular families and circumstances examined. What remains clear from the letters and conduct manuals is that courtship was never a private affair. It unfolded instead as another arena in which reputation, precedence, and careful performance determined whose prospects would advance and whose would quietly recede into the background of social memory. Even within the watchful presence of chaperones and the layered expectations that surrounded every exchange of glances or words, the small accessories carried into ballrooms, drawing rooms, and garden walks supplied a parallel language that could convey what direct speech dared not attempt. Period letters and conduct manuals preserved in family archives suggest that fans in particular became instruments of coded exchange, their movements interpreted by those attuned to the signals while remaining opaque or innocuous to casual observers. A young woman might hold her fan open before her face to indicate a desire for privacy and conversation, or close it with a sharp snap to signal disinterest. Yet historians note that such gestures carried no universal dictionary and likely varied according to the circle in which they were used, the region, or even the particular understanding between two individuals who had previously agreed upon their meaning through earlier, safer interactions. The possibility that a slight tilt of the fan toward the heart signified affection, or that drawing it across the eyes implied a wish to conceal tears of either joy or frustration, allowed for expressions of feeling that might otherwise have been impossible under constant supervision, though the same ambiguity meant that an unintended audience could assign quite different interpretations and set rumours in motion. Gloves added another stratum to this silent vocabulary, their removal or placement on a table or chair carrying implications that extended beyond mere comfort or fashion. Accounts from the time indicate that a lady might slowly draw off one glove during a prolonged call as a sign that she felt at ease in the company, and perhaps welcomed further intimacy of conversation, while leaving both gloves on could serve as a quiet barrier, a reminder that the encounter remained strictly formal. Placement mattered as well. Resting a glove palm upward on a surface was sometimes read as an invitation to approach, whereas folding them neatly together and setting them aside might communicate that the wearer wished to conclude the visit without giving offence. These actions occurred within the same rooms where chaperones sat nearby, and their subtlety allowed participants to test boundaries without uttering words that could later be repeated. Yet the very fact that such meanings depended on shared recognition introduced risk, for a gesture performed in one household might be misunderstood in another, transforming an intended courtesy into evidence of forwardness, or conversely turning a polite withdrawal into an unintended slight that cooled relations between families. The messages embedded in these everyday objects extended beyond single movements, to encompass sequences and combinations that could unfold across an evening or a series of calls. A fan held loosely in the left hand while the right glove was adjusted might suggest availability for a further introduction, while the reverse order could convey hesitation or the need to consult a parent before any advance. Historians examining surviving correspondence have found occasional references to young people who developed private systems with particular partners, using the angle at which a fan rested against the cheek, or the manner in which a glove was offered and received to convey layers of reassurance or caution that supplemented the carefully neutral topics permitted in spoken exchange. Such practices likely emerged from necessity, as the constant presence of observers made overt declarations hazardous. Yet they also created new opportunities for misreading that could ripple outward through social networks. A single misinterpreted placement of a glove on a pianoforte during a musical evening, for instance, might be recounted differently by two witnesses, one seeing invitation, where another saw only absent-minded habit, and the resulting discrepancy could reach drawing rooms across town before the principals themselves understood what had been attributed to them. When these gestures went awry, the consequences could prove as damaging as any ill-judged letter or unchaperoned moment. Diaries from the period occasionally record instances in which a young woman found herself questioned by relatives after a fan movement at an assembly was reported as overly encouraging, or a gentleman discovered that his decision to remove his gloves during a morning visit had been interpreted by a chaperone as presumptuous, prompting a cooling of invitations that affected his prospects more broadly. The absence of any fixed code meant that interpretations often reflected the pre-existing biases or rivalries of those who observed them, allowing a gesture intended as polite withdrawal to be recast as haughty dismissal, or worse, as flirtation directed toward the wrong party. In households already navigating delicate marriage negotiations, such misunderstandings could tip balances of favour, leading families to redirect attention toward other suitors whose accessories had conveyed more reliably conventional signals. The strain of maintaining awareness of both spoken conversation and these silent accompaniments appears in some letters as a source of exhaustion, with writers describing the mental effort required to track every tilt and fold while still appearing composed and attentive to the chaperone's presence. At the same time, the system offered limited avenues for genuine connection to surface despite the constraints. A chaperone who recognized the language of fans and gloves from her own earlier experiences might choose not to intervene when a sequence of movements suggested mutual understanding rather than impropriety, thereby granting a small measure of latitude within the larger structure of surveillance. Families that had invested time in observing these exchanges across multiple gatherings sometimes came to view consistent patterns of accessory language as evidence of compatibility, interpreting a repeated gesture of glove removal in the same company as steadiness rather than presumption. Historians continue to weigh the extent to which such practices empowered participants to navigate restrictions creatively, or simply added another layer of performance that reinforced the very hierarchies they appeared to circumvent, with surviving evidence pointing toward both outcomes depending on the particular social circle and the individuals involved. What the letters make plain is that these objects, carried so lightly into every social setting, functioned as extensions of the same careful calculation that governed seating arrangements and correspondence, their messages capable of advancing or derailing prospects with equal force once the wrong observer assigned them meaning. The interplay between fan and glove signals and the broader rules of courtship also varied by setting, creating further complexity for those attempting to employ them. In the more crowded atmosphere of a ballroom, where multiple conversations overlapped and glances could be intercepted from across the room, a fan gesture might travel farther and reach unintended recipients, multiplying the chance that a signal meant for one person would be read by another whose subsequent recounting altered its intent. During quieter morning calls, the same movements occurred under closer scrutiny, yet with fewer witnesses, allowing slightly bolder placements of gloves or slower sequences of fan adjustments before the visit concluded. Country house parties introduced still different conditions, as extended proximity over days rather than hours meant that accessory languages could develop incrementally, with each evening's gestures building upon those of the previous afternoon. Yet the presence of additional family members and servants increased the number of potential interpreters who might carry accounts into neighbouring estates. These contextual differences meant that mastery of the system required not only knowledge of possible meanings, but also sensitivity to the particular environment, a skill that some acquired through observation, while others learned through the quiet correction of a parent or the sudden withdrawal of an invitation. The emotional weight attached to these small actions appears in personal writings as both a source of quiet satisfaction when understood correctly, and a persistent undercurrent of anxiety when their reception remained uncertain. A young woman might spend the carriage ride home replaying the angle at which she had held her fan during a particular exchange, wondering whether the gentleman had registered the intended reassurance, or whether the chaperone's presence had prevented any shared recognition. Gentlemen faced parallel uncertainties, aware that an ill-timed removal of gloves could be reported back to their own families as evidence of insufficient restraint. Over time, these accumulated uncertainties contributed to the overall sense that social navigation demanded constant vigilance, extending even to the way one carried or adjusted the most ordinary accessories. The very ordinariness of fans and gloves, items required by fashion and climate alike, rendered their language especially potent, because it could be practiced without drawing the explicit attention that a spoken word or a written note would invite. As the season progressed and reputation solidified or frayed according to how these signals were received and retold, the language of fans and gloves remained one of the few avenues through which individuals could attempt to shape their own narratives within the larger framework of surveillance. Its effectiveness depended on the fragile alignment of intention, recognition, and discretion among all who witnessed it, an alignment that could never be fully guaranteed. Historians examining the period note that the absence of any centralized or authoritative guide to these gestures likely preserved their usefulness for those who employed them, while simultaneously heightening the potential for the very social missteps they were meant to avoid. In this way, the accessories of daily life became both tools and hazards, their messages capable of sustaining connection or precipitating the same exclusions that other breaches of etiquette produced. Even the most carefully calibrated signals carried by fans and gloves could be overtaken without warning by the heavier protocols that descended whenever death entered a household, turning the same drawing rooms and assembly halls into spaces governed by an etiquette whose weight seemed designed to extend the period of loss far beyond the initial shock. Letters and diaries preserved from the era suggest that mourning rules imposed a form of ongoing calculation that drained emotional reserves and social energies alike, requiring participants to track not only their own conduct, but also the precise durations and gradations expected by relatives, neighbours, and the wider circle of acquaintance whose judgments could determine whether one emerged from grief with prospects intact or subtly diminished. Rather than a single uniform observance, these protocols unfolded in stages whose boundaries remained open to interpretation, depending on the closeness of the relation and the particular customs of a given family or region, with full or deep mourning typically demanding unrelieved black garments of specific dull fabrics, such as bombazine or parramatta for widows and mothers, while more distant connections might observe shorter intervals marked by graduated allowances for lustreless silk or the eventual introduction of grey and lavender in what came to be called half-mourning. Conduct manuals of the period, though they offered general outlines rather than fixed statutes, implied that the first months after a loss might prohibit almost all social movement outside necessary calls of condolence. Yet the absence of any single authoritative code meant that one household could interpret the same interval as requiring total withdrawal, while another viewed continued attendance at quiet evening gatherings as permissible, creating opportunities for misjudgment that might later be recounted as either insufficient respect or unseemly haste to resume ordinary pleasures. The effect on the social calendar proved especially pervasive, as periods of mourning could cancel or postpone planned visits, balls and presentations for months or even years, forcing families to recalibrate invitations and expectations in ways that rippled outward through networks already attuned to the smallest shifts in availability. A young woman whose father had died might find herself barred from the very assemblies where earlier fan and glove exchanges had begun to shape her prospects. Her wardrobe now restricted to garments whose sombre cut and fabric offered no scope for the subtle adjustments that had once conveyed interest or reserve, while her mother navigated the additional layer of deciding when the household could again receive morning callers without appearing to slight the memory of the deceased. Historians examining surviving correspondence note that such interruptions rarely aligned neatly with the rhythms of courtship or seasonal movement between town and country, leaving some individuals to wonder whether a delayed introduction or an unreturned call would be attributed to proper observance or to a cooling of interest that had nothing to do with grief. Wardrobe requirements compounded the disruption, since the transition from deep black to the permitted relief of jet jewellery, or later to half-mourning shades, demanded not only new purchases, but also the careful storage or alteration of existing clothing, a process that itself became subject to scrutiny whenever acquaintances compared the timing of a first appearance in grey with the published announcements of a death or the length of time since the funeral. The financial burden attached to these observances added a further dimension of strain, particularly for those whose resources were already stretched by the costs of illness or burial, as proper mourning attire could require yards of expensive fabric, specialized trimmings, and multiple sets of clothing to accommodate the gradual easing of restrictions without ever risking an appearance of levity. Accounts from the time indicate that widows of modest means might find themselves obliged to commission garments whose quality signalled respectability to observers, while simultaneously depleting savings that could otherwise have supported continued independence. Yet the very visibility of these choices meant that any perceived shortcut, such as dyeing an older dress rather than purchasing new material, risked being interpreted as either parsimony or insufficient feeling. Gentlemen faced parallel pressures, their black suits and hatbands needing to conform to expectations during calls of condolence or attendance at memorial services, with the added consideration that professional obligations might demand an earlier return to ordinary dress, whose timing could invite comment from clients or colleagues attuned to the same signals of status and deference. In households already navigating delicate negotiations over inheritance or marriage portions, the cumulative expense could shift balances of influence, prompting some families to weigh the social cost of abbreviated mourning against the economic relief of resuming normal expenditures sooner than custom might strictly allow. Such calculations extended into the management of daily interactions, where even the smallest decisions about receiving visitors or acknowledging acquaintances on the street became charged with the possibility of giving offence through either excessive austerity or premature resumption of ordinary civilities. A family still within the first stage of observance might decline an invitation with a carefully worded note, whose tone itself had to balance acknowledgement of the loss against any hint of reproach toward the sender, while the recipient of such a note might wonder whether the refusal reflected genuine constraint or a strategic withdrawal that would later affect other connections. The language of accessories, so recently explored in the context of courtship, found new and narrower application here, as black gloves or the arrangement of a mourning veil could themselves become subjects of interpretation when their placement or removal during a condolence call suggested either genuine absorption in grief or a calculated performance meant to elicit sympathy or support. Diaries occasionally record instances in which the precise shade of black or the presence of permitted trimming was noted and discussed in subsequent letters, illustrating how the rules, far from providing a clear framework, often amplified the same uncertainties that had characterized lighter social exchanges. Over extended periods, The sustained attention required to maintain these observances could contribute to a broader sense of depletion, as individuals tracked not only their own compliance, but also the visible adherence of others whose lapses might reflect on the entire circle of acquaintance. The possibility that a slight variation in the duration of full mourning might be read as either admirable restraint or cold calculation encouraged a form of vigilance that persisted even after the formal stages had ended, with some families continuing to favour subdued colours, or limit entertainments out of habit, or lingering concern for appearances. Historians continue to consider the extent to which these protocols served to channel collective responses to loss into recognisable forms that preserved social order, or whether they primarily added another stratum of performance that could obscure more varied personal experiences of grief beneath the uniform surface of black fabric and measured withdrawal. What the surviving records make evident is that the rules intersected with every other layer of etiquette already in place, transforming the ordinary navigation of visits, correspondence, and public movement into an exercise whose demands could extend the draining effects of loss well beyond the initial period of immediate sorrow. Even as the layered observances of mourning continued to shape the boundaries of permissible movement and exchange, the deeper structures of entry into society itself remained governed by an equally intricate set of protocols surrounding formal introductions and presentations at court, protocols whose demands could determine the entire trajectory of an individual's social existence long before any question of courtship or assembly attendance arose. The process of being presented at court stood among the most scrutinized thresholds of Regency life, one whose formalities unfolded within the royal drawing rooms or levees under the gaze of the monarch or regent, and whose smallest missteps carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate occasion. Young women of eligible families approached this moment after careful preparation that included not only the acquisition of prescribed garments in white or pale shades, with ostrich feathers and trains, but also the rehearsal of the deep curtsy required upon approach, a gesture whose execution had to convey both deference and composure without any hint of hesitation or excess that might suggest either undue familiarity or insufficient respect. Diaries and letters preserved from the period often record the preceding weeks as filled with anxious consultations over the precise length of the train, the arrangement of the headdress, and the choice of sponsor, since only a woman already presented and of established standing could perform the introduction, a restriction that itself narrowed the circle of possible advocates to those whose own reputations remained unblemished by prior social miscalculations. The identity of the introducer carried weight precisely because it signalled the newcomer's alignment within existing networks of patronage and approval, meaning that a presentation sponsored by a countess or a well-connected matron of the ton could open subsequent pathways to invitations and recognition that a more marginal sponsor might fail to secure. Contemporary accounts suggest that families sometimes weighed the advantages of delaying a presentation until a sufficiently influential sponsor became available against the risk that prolonged postponement might itself be interpreted as a lack of readiness or resources, creating a calculus in which timing intersected with questions of lineage and connection rather than following any single prescribed schedule. Gentlemen faced parallel yet distinct procedures at levees, where their presentations typically occurred through military or court officials and emphasized different markers of status such as uniform or official dress. Yet the underlying principle remained consistent that only recognized figures could vouch for the newcomer without risking the perception of presumption. Historians examining these practices note that the rules governing who might introduce whom were never codified in a single statute, but emerged instead from accumulated custom and precedent, allowing for regional or familial variations that could produce conflicting expectations when individuals moved between London circles and provincial assemblies. An improper introduction, whether arising from an unsanctioned sponsor, an incomplete announcement of titles and connections, or an accidental encounter that bypassed formal channels, risked casting a shadow over subsequent interactions that proved difficult to dispel. Letters from the era occasionally describe instances in which a young person introduced by a relative whose own standing had been questioned found invitations to subsequent events withheld or extended only with noticeable reserve, the uncertainty leaving both the newcomer and their family to wonder whether the slight stemmed from the introduction itself or from some unrelated shift in acquaintance. Such moments underscored how introductions functioned less as neutral formalities and more as mechanisms for affirming or withholding social recognition, with the potential to elevate prospects when executed within its accepted bounds, or to constrain them when any element appeared irregular. The disaster of such missteps lay not only in immediate exclusion, but in the lingering interpretive space they created, as observers might later attribute a lack of advancement to the initial presentation rather than to later conduct, thereby compounding the pressure on families to ensure every detail aligned with prevailing expectations. Social standing itself could be made or unmade through these early encounters, since a successful presentation at court often served as the gateway to the morning calls, balls, and country house gatherings that followed, while any perceived flaw might limit access to the very settings where further connections were formed. Accounts preserved in correspondence indicate that some young women returned from their presentations with renewed confidence that translated into broader acceptance, whereas others navigated a more tentative reception, whose causes remained open to speculation, whether rooted in the sponsor's influence, the manner of the curtsy, or simply the prevailing mood of the court on that particular day. The emotional dimension of this process added another layer of strain, as the anticipation surrounding the event could occupy weeks or months of preparation whose outcome remained uncertain until the moment itself passed, leaving participants to interpret subtle cues from the monarch's demeanour or the subsequent flow of invitations as signs of favour or its absence. When mourning periods overlapped with the customary seasons for presentations, families faced additional decisions about whether to proceed with modified observances or to defer entirely, a choice whose implications for future standing could not be fully anticipated, and whose resolution depended on the particular interpretations current within their circle. The financial considerations attached to these introductions mirrored those encountered in other areas of etiquette, yet carried distinct weight, because the garments and accessories required for court were often non-transferable to everyday use, demanding outlays that could strain households already managing the costs of travel or lodging in London. Surviving records suggest that some families borrowed or altered existing pieces to meet the requirements without drawing notice, while others commissioned entirely new ensembles whose quality itself became subject to quiet assessment by those already established at court. Such calculations extended to the selection of sponsors, since an introduction through a figure of higher rank might entail reciprocal obligations whose long-term demands could offset the immediate advantage. Gentlemen similarly navigated questions of appropriate dress and introduction at levees, where the costs of regimentals or court attire intersected with professional aspirations that might benefit from visible royal recognition. Beyond the court itself, the rules governing ordinary introductions in drawing rooms and assemblies followed parallel principles of sponsorship and propriety, requiring that no person be presented to another without mutual consent and an appropriate intermediary, a convention whose breach could imply either ignorance or deliberate overstepping. The potential for disaster in these settings arose when an introduction occurred without the necessary preliminaries, leaving one party uncertain whether acknowledgement was expected, or whether the encounter should be treated as accidental and therefore outside formal recognition. Diaries record moments in which such ambiguities prompted subsequent letters of clarification, or, conversely, a careful avoidance that preserved dignity while leaving the underlying question unresolved. The effect on social standing proved cumulative, as repeated successful introductions could weave an individual more tightly into the fabric of acceptable society, whereas a single misjudged encounter might prompt others to proceed with greater caution in future exchanges. Interpretations of these rules varied according to the observer's position within the hierarchy, with some viewing the strictures as necessary safeguards that protected the coherence of elite networks, while others experienced them as arbitrary barriers whose navigation demanded constant vigilance. The absence of any centralized authority meant that practices could shift subtly between seasons or between the London season and country gatherings, creating opportunities for misalignments that later correspondents might attribute either to changing customs or to personal oversight. When these introduction protocols intersected with the demands of public behaviour or correspondence, the same attention to gradations of status and propriety reappeared, reinforcing the sense that every social threshold carried implications extending outward through the broader calendar of visits and entertainments. Over time, the cumulative weight of ensuring correct introductions and presentations could contribute to a pervasive awareness of social positioning that persisted even after the initial entry into society had been achieved, as individuals continued to monitor the sources of new acquaintances and the manner in which they themselves were presented to others. Historians continue to consider the extent to which these mechanisms primarily preserved established hierarchies, or whether they occasionally allowed for limited forms of advancement when a well-timed introduction aligned with other favourable circumstances. Yet the surviving evidence makes clear that the rules operated as one more intersecting layer within the larger system of Regency etiquette, whose effects on daily life and long-term prospects remained subject to ongoing interpretation and adjustment. Even as the protocols of formal introductions and court presentations continued to shape the initial thresholds of social recognition, the daily rhythms of movement through public spaces imposed their own exacting demands, transforming what might appear as simple strolls into carefully calibrated performances where every step, glance and gesture could reinforce or undermine standing within the ton. Contemporary accounts preserved in letters and journals from the period describe the practice of promenading along designated routes in London parks such as Hyde Park or Green Park, or along fashionable thoroughfares like Bond Street and Piccadilly, as governed by unspoken yet widely understood codes that dictated not only the hours deemed appropriate for such outings, but also the precise configurations of companionship that preserved decorum. These promenades typically unfolded in the late morning or early afternoon when the fashionable world was most likely to be abroad, allowing participants to display their attire, observe others, and exchange the minimal acknowledgements required by acquaintance without venturing into the territory of prolonged conversation that might invite speculation about undue familiarity. The question of who might accompany whom carried particular weight, as an unmarried young woman could not be seen walking alone or even with a gentleman unrelated to her, without risking immediate gossip that might circulate through drawing rooms by evening, whereas a married lady enjoyed somewhat greater latitude yet still navigated expectations that her escort reflect either familial connection or established respectability. Gentlemen, for their part, might walk together in pairs or small groups, their conversations presumed to touch on matters of politics, sport or club life. Yet any deviation toward too close an association with a lady of lower rank or questionable reputation could prompt observers to question the motives behind the pairing, especially if the route chosen veered away from the most visible and therefore safest paths. Historians examining period correspondence note that these arrangements were never fixed by statute but arose from accumulated precedent, allowing for subtle variations depending on whether the setting was the relatively contained environment of a provincial assembly town or the more intensely scrutinised arena of London during the height of the season, where an apparently innocent choice of companion might later be interpreted through the lens of prior introductions or the absence thereof. Rules for acknowledging acquaintances encountered along these routes further complicated the exercise, requiring that the person of higher rank or the lady in question initiate any bow, curtsy, or verbal greeting, with the precise depth and duration of the gesture signalling the degree of intimacy or mere civility intended. A slight inclination of the head might suffice for a distant connection whose name one only vaguely recalled, while a deeper bow accompanied by a lifted hat could affirm closer ties. Yet any miscalculation risked either appearing presumptuous or, conversely, delivering an unintended slight that observers might seize upon as evidence of cooling regard. Diaries from the era frequently record the anxiety surrounding these moments, as individuals weighed whether to quicken their pace to avoid an encounter altogether or to linger in hopes of a favourable recognition, all while maintaining the composed posture expected of their station. The potential for scandal arose swiftly when such acknowledgments were omitted without clear justification, particularly if the slighted party held influence within the same circles, leading to whispered inquiries at subsequent morning calls about whether some prior breach had occurred, or whether the omission stemmed merely from distraction or poor eyesight. Improper public behaviour encompassed a broad range of infractions that could stain reputations more enduringly than a single misstep at a ball, ranging from walking at an unseemly pace that suggested either haste or a lack of leisure, to engaging in animated conversation that carried beyond the immediate party and drew attention from passers-by. A lady who linked arms too closely with her escort, or who permitted her gaze to linger on shop windows in a manner interpreted as acquisitive rather than refined, might find herself the subject of correspondence that travelled between households, detailing the incident with enough particularity to influence future invitations. Gentlemen faced parallel hazards, as an overly loud laugh or a gesture that appeared too familiar with a female companion could be read as evidence of compromised morals, especially if the encounter took place near the boundaries of less reputable districts, where the fashionable world occasionally brushed against other classes. Accounts suggest that families sometimes instructed younger members to rehearse these public behaviours in private gardens before venturing onto the streets, practising the measured stride, the appropriate angle of the head for acknowledgement, and the art of disengaging from an unwanted conversation without giving offence, all in the service of preserving the delicate equilibrium of social perception. The intersection of these public conduct rules with the lingering observances of mourning added another layer of complexity, as individuals in black or grey attire were expected to maintain an even greater reserve, avoiding not only improper companions but also any appearance of enjoying the promenade too visibly, lest observers interpret their presence outdoors as insufficient grief. Young people navigating their first seasons often found these expectations particularly burdensome, since the same routes that offered opportunities for advantageous sightings and introductions also exposed them to constant scrutiny from those already established, creating a calculus in which each outing represented both potential advancement and the risk of irreversible misjudgment. Historians considering the surviving evidence note that while some contemporaries viewed these strictures as essential protections for the coherence of elite society, others experienced them as exhausting constraints that demanded constant self-monitoring, with the emotional toll accumulating across repeated public appearances where a single unguarded moment could prompt reinterpretation of earlier successes at court or in drawing rooms. Further nuances emerged in the choice of specific locations and times, as certain paths within the parks were understood to be more prestigious than others, and venturing on to less favoured routes might signal either limited access to fashionable intelligence or a deliberate withdrawal from competition that itself invited comment. Women walking without a proper chaperone, even if accompanied by a maid or footman, risked the perception of vulnerability or impropriety that could extend to questions about their family's oversight, while gentlemen appearing too frequently in the company of the same lady without evident marital intentions might fuel speculation about secret engagements or less honourable arrangements. The scandal attached to improper behaviour proved especially potent because it operated in the interpretive space between public observation and private correspondence, where an incident witnessed by one party could be embellished or softened in retelling, leaving the affected individual uncertain which version had reached influential ears and how it might colour subsequent interactions at assemblies or country gatherings. Over time, the cumulative demands of these walking and public behaviour codes reinforced the broader system of Regency etiquette by extending the principles of sponsorship, rank, and measured acknowledgement from formal thresholds into the everyday movement of bodies through shared spaces, ensuring that social positioning remained visible and therefore contestable at every turn. Contemporary observers occasionally remarked on the artistry required to navigate these expectations gracefully, noting that those who mastered the subtle language of pace, gesture, and selective recognition often secured invitations and regard that eluded others despite equal or superior lineage, while missteps in public could close doors that even a successful court presentation had opened. The absence of any single authoritative text codifying these practices meant that individuals relied on observation, family instruction, and the occasional clarifying letter to discern shifting expectations between seasons or between London and provincial settings, creating opportunities for both alignment and misalignment that later historians have interpreted as evidence of the system's flexibility as well as its rigidity. In this way, the rules governing promenades and public encounters functioned as one more intersecting layer within the larger framework, their effects on daily life and long-term prospects continuing to unfold through the ongoing process of interpretation and adjustment that characterized Regency social existence. The financial dimensions attached to maintaining appropriate public appearances further intertwined with these behavioral codes, as the cost of suitable walking attire, from gloves and hats to the carriages that might convey one to the park's edge, added practical pressures that families balanced against the risk of appearing either overly ostentatious or insufficiently equipped for fashionable display. Letters from the period sometimes describe the careful selection of routes that allowed for maximum visibility without excessive expenditure on transport, or the strategic timing of outings to coincide with known gatherings of influential acquaintances, all while preserving the appearance of effortless leisure that the codes themselves demanded. Such calculations extended to the management of chance encounters, where the decision to acknowledge or pass by an acquaintance might be influenced not only by rank, but by the anticipated ripple effects on one's own circle, particularly if the individual in question belonged to a family whose standing had recently fluctuated due to mourning, financial reverses, or prior social missteps. Historians examining these dynamics observe that the rules, while appearing arbitrary to later observers, reflected a society in which reputation functioned as a form of currency whose value depended on constant visible affirmation through precisely these public performances. An individual who consistently executed the acknowledgements, companionship choices, and paces expected of their position could accumulate advantages that manifested in broader access to events and connections, whereas repeated or notable lapses might prompt a gradual withdrawal of recognition that proved difficult to reverse without dramatic intervention, such as a well-placed marriage or inheritance. The emotional texture of these experiences emerges in personal writings that convey both the satisfaction of a successful promenade, marked by favourable bows and subsequent invitations, and the lingering unease following an ambiguous encounter whose meaning remained open to speculation among observers. When these public behaviour protocols overlapped with the demands of courtship or correspondence, the same attention to gradations of propriety reappeared, ensuring that every outing carried implications extending outward through the calendar of visits and entertainments that structured Regency life. Interpretations of the appropriate degree of reserve or display varied according to the observer's own position, with some viewing strict adherence as a mark of refinement, and others perceiving it as an unnecessary burden that constrained natural interactions. Yet the practical effect remained one of heightened awareness whenever individuals stepped into shared public spaces. The potential for disaster in these settings arose not only from overt breaches, but from the quieter uncertainties that surrounded marginal cases, such as whether a recent introduction at court warranted a public acknowledgement, or whether the presence of a chaperone sufficiently mitigated the risks of walking with a particular companion. Diaries record instances in which families debated these questions in advance of outings, weighing the benefits of visibility against the hazards of misinterpretation, and the outcomes of such deliberations often depended on the particular social climate prevailing that season, rather than any fixed principle. In this manner, the codes of walking and public behaviour extended the intricate mechanisms of recognition and exclusion into the most ordinary movements of daily life, their influence persisting through the accumulated weight of small decisions whose consequences could not be fully anticipated at the moment of choice. As the demands of navigating public promenades and chance encounters continued to impose their layered expectations on daily movement, extending the principles of rank, acknowledgement, and measured restraint into every visible step, the private yet perpetually vulnerable domain of correspondence emerged as an equally fraught arena, where the same imperatives of propriety found expression through ink and paper rather than gesture or pace. Contemporary accounts preserved in diaries and surviving collections of letters reveal how the act of writing itself became subject to an elaborate calculus of permission and precedent, with unmarried young women generally restricted from initiating correspondence with gentlemen outside their immediate family circle, unless a formal engagement or long-standing familial tie provided explicit sanction, lest the mere exchange suggest an intimacy that observers might later interpret as compromising. Married women enjoyed marginally greater latitude in addressing male acquaintances on matters of business or shared social concerns. Yet even here the content remained circumscribed by expectations that letters avoid any tone of undue familiarity or personal revelation that could be misconstrued if intercepted or read aloud in company. Historians examining these patterns note that such restrictions arose not from any single codified statute, but from accumulated social precedent, allowing subtle variations depending on whether the correspondence resided in the intense scrutiny of London during the season or the comparatively insulated setting of a provincial estate, where an apparently innocuous note might pass without comment or, conversely, ignite speculation if its existence became known through servants or mutual acquaintances. The potential for letters to be leaked or deliberately circulated added a dimension of risk that transformed routine exchanges into sources of ongoing anxiety, as even the most carefully phrased missive could fall into unintended hands through theft, careless storage, or malicious disclosure by a recipient seeking advantage. Period journals frequently record instances in which a single misplaced letter, detailing private opinions about a mutual acquaintance or expressing tentative romantic interest, led to immediate social repercussions, including the withdrawal of invitations, whispered campaigns that questioned the writer's judgment, or in extreme cases the abrupt termination of a promising courtship that had otherwise navigated the surveillance of morning calls and ballroom encounters without incident. One diarist from the era describes the sleepless nights following the discovery that a note intended solely for a trusted cousin had been shown to a third party, illustrating how the physical persistence of written words allowed interpretations to multiply long after the original moment of composition, turning what might have been a fleeting confidence into enduring evidence of indiscretion. Such episodes underscored the precariousness of reputation as a form of currency, where the absence of any reliable means to retract or contextualize a leaked letter left individuals reliant on the discretion of others whose motives could never be fully assured, prompting many to adopt the precaution of destroying correspondence once read, or of employing ambiguous phrasing that preserved plausible deniability should the contents surface unexpectedly. Proper form further complicated these exchanges, requiring not only adherence to conventions of address and salutation that mirrored the hierarchies of rank, but also the selection of appropriate stationery whose quality, size, and even watermark could signal refinement or betray aspirations beyond one station. Letters were expected to employ a particular style of folding and sealing that prevented casual reading by messengers or household staff, with black-edged paper reserved for mourning periods and finer-laid papers preferred for formal introductions or requests, while deviations such as overly ornate scripts or excessive length risked appearing affected or presumptuous. Contemporary etiquette guides and personal correspondence from the period suggest that the opening and closing formulas themselves conveyed precise gradations of respect, with a simple "Sir" or "Madam" appropriate for distant connections and more elaborate expressions reserved for those whose favour one sought to cultivate. Yet any misstep in these details could be seized upon as evidence of poor breeding or insufficient attention to the social codes that governed every interaction. Historians considering the surviving evidence observe that these material requirements intertwined with broader economic pressures, as the cost of quality paper and reliable postal services added practical burdens that families balanced against the necessity of maintaining connections, sometimes resulting in delayed replies that themselves invited comment about waning regard or divided attentions. Correspondence crossed into dangerous territory most readily when it ventured beyond the narrow bounds of civility into expressions of personal sentiment, political opinion, or financial detail that might later be weaponized by rivals or misinterpreted by those outside the intended circle. A letter from a gentleman to an unmarried woman that alluded even obliquely to future meetings without the presence of chaperones, or one that referenced shared secrets from a country house gathering, could transform an otherwise unremarkable acquaintance into grounds for scandal if its tone suggested emotional attachment exceeding what formal introductions permitted. Diaries from the period frequently capture the tension surrounding such boundaries, as writers weighed the desire for genuine connection against the knowledge that any deviation might be preserved indefinitely, allowing later readers to reconstruct narratives of impropriety that bore little resemblance to the original intent. In cases where letters touched on sensitive matters such as family debts or romantic disappointments, the risk multiplied because the written record offered concrete proof that spoken assurances could not, prompting some correspondents to adopt coded language or to limit exchanges to the safest topics of weather, mutual acquaintances, and forthcoming assemblies. The intersection of these epistolary rules with the lingering observances of mourning or the delicate negotiations of courtship added further complexity, as individuals in reduced circumstances or navigating tentative affections found themselves doubly constrained, their letters scrutinized not only for content, but for any suggestion that grief or attachment had compromised the required reserve. Over time, the cumulative weight of these correspondence protocols reinforced the broader system of Regency etiquette by extending the mechanisms of recognition and exclusion into the ostensibly private sphere of written communication, ensuring that social positioning remained visible and contestable even when individuals were separated by distance or circumstance. Contemporary observers occasionally remarked on the artistry required to compose letters that conveyed warmth without crossing into presumption, or that maintained distance without appearing cold, noting that those who mastered this balance often secured alliances and invitations that eluded others despite comparable lineage or resources. The absence of any single authoritative manual meant that individuals relied on observation of successful models, family instruction, and the occasional clarifying exchange to discern shifting expectations between seasons or regions, creating opportunities for both alignment and misalignment that later historians have interpreted as evidence of the system's adaptability as well as its stringency. In this way, the nightmares attending correspondence arose not solely from overt breaches, but from the quieter uncertainties that surrounded every choice of recipient, phrasing, and preservation, their effects rippling outward through the calendar of visits and entertainments that structured daily existence and leaving participants to navigate an interpretive landscape where the consequences of a single ill-considered sentence could not be fully anticipated at the moment of sealing. Such calculations extended naturally into the management of replies and the timing of dispatches, where a prompt response might affirm regard while an unexplained delay could fuel speculation about cooling interest or divided loyalties, particularly if the letter in question followed a public encounter whose acknowledgement had already invited comment among observers. Families sometimes instructed younger members to draft and redraft important notes under supervision, rehearsing the appropriate tone and length in much the same manner that they practiced the measured stride of a promenade, all in service of preserving the delicate equilibrium of perception that determined future access to drawing rooms and assemblies. The emotional texture of these experiences surfaces repeatedly in personal writings that convey both the satisfaction of a well-received letter, marked by favourable replies and subsequent invitations, and the lingering unease following an ambiguous exchange whose meaning remained open to reinterpretation once it left the writer's control. When these epistolary expectations overlapped with the demands of public behaviour or the protocols of country gatherings, the same attention to gradations of propriety reappeared, ensuring that every written word carried implications extending through networks of acquaintance whose reactions could never be entirely predicted. Interpretations of the appropriate degree of candour or reserve varied according to the positions of sender and recipient, with some viewing strict adherence as a mark of refinement, and others perceiving it as an unnecessary constraint that stifled authentic connection. Yet the practical effect remained one of heightened vigilance whenever pen met paper in the service of maintaining standing within the ton. These same considerations of discretion and calculated expression found their most intricate application in the extended sojourns that defined country house parties, where the boundaries between private retreat and public performance blurred under the continuous observation of fellow guests and attentive staff. Historians examining period diaries and household accounts observed that an invitation to such gatherings often arrived through carefully worded correspondence that itself had to navigate the restrictions on initiating contact, with hosts weighing the potential for harmonious company against the risks of introducing individuals whose recent letters or rumoured indiscretions might unsettle the delicate equilibrium of the household. Once accepted, the guest preparations extended far beyond packing trunks, encompassing the selection of attire suitable for every conceivable activity, from morning rides to evening assemblies, alongside the mental rehearsal of conversational topics that avoided any echo of the personal revelations sometimes risked in private letters. The journey itself carried implications, as the mode of arrival, whether by private carriage or hired post-chaise, signalled status to any observers at the estate gates, and a delayed response to the invitation could already plant seeds of doubt about one's regard for the host's convenience. Upon reaching the country house, the choreography of welcome unfolded according to unspoken gradations of rank and familiarity, with the host or hostess emerging to greet arrivals in a sequence that mirrored the hierarchies preserved in correspondence, ensuring that higher-ranking guests received the first attentions, while others waited in a manner that preserved dignity without appearing presumptuous. Servants conveyed luggage according to precise protocols that prevented any guest from seeming to direct household operations. Yet the placement of rooms reflected subtle judgments, as proximity to the family wing or views over the gardens might indicate favour, or, conversely, a measured distance that hinted at reservations formed from prior acquaintance. Historians note that these initial hours often set the tone for the entire visit, with early interactions at tea or in the library testing the guest's ability to engage without overstepping, such as inquiring too directly about the estate's management or referencing shared connections in ways that echoed the guarded phrasing required in letters. The exhausting dimension of guest etiquette arose from the necessity of constant adaptability, as one navigated not only the host's preferences, but also the temperaments of other visitors whose presence might last days or weeks, all while maintaining the reserve that correspondence had already demanded in written form. Daily rhythms within the house imposed further layers of obligation, beginning with the timing of appearances at breakfast, where guests were expected to join at varying hours without seeming either overly eager or indolent, a balance that allowed the hostess to gauge interest for the day's planned activities such as walks, shooting parties, or indoor pursuits like music and reading. Rules governing interactions dictated that guests refrain from monopolizing the host's time or initiating conversations on topics that might divide the company, such as political opinions or financial matters best confined to sealed letters, while hosts in turn bore responsibility for ensuring no guest felt overlooked or, equally, overly scrutinized during these communal moments. The complex choreography extended to afternoon occupations, where participation in outdoor excursions required adherence to dress codes and pace that accommodated the least vigorous members without drawing attention to any individual's limitations, and evening gatherings demanded shifts in attire and demeanour that signalled the transition from casual discourse to more formal entertainment. Contemporary accounts suggest variations in these patterns depending on the region and the season, with northern estates sometimes permitting greater informality during inclement weather, while southern houses adhered more rigidly to London-influenced standards, allowing historians to interpret the system as adaptable rather than uniformly oppressive. Host and guest interactions further complicated the visit through expectations around gratitude and reciprocity, as guests were to express appreciation for every convenience without appearing obsequious, often through small gestures like contributing to conversation or assisting with minor household amusements that eased the hostess's burden. Hosts, meanwhile, managed the flow of invitations to meals and excursions with an eye toward balancing company so that no faction dominated, a task that could involve last-minute adjustments based on overheard remarks or observed tensions reminiscent of the misread letters that had already strained reputations. The potential for misunderstanding loomed large in shared spaces such as the drawing room after dinner, where card games or readings required participants to defer to those of higher rank in choosing partners or topics, lest a casual preference be interpreted as a slight that might later circulate through the very correspondence networks linking estates across counties. Diaries preserved from the era frequently capture the mental fatigue of such vigilance, with writers noting how even restful moments in one's assigned chamber offered little respite when the knowledge of potential observation through servants or open doors persisted. When guests inadvertently or deliberately broke these protocols, the repercussions unfolded gradually yet inexorably, beginning with subtle withdrawals of favour such as exclusion from select outings, or cooler tones in subsequent invitations that hinted at diminished standing without overt confrontation. A misplaced comment at table, an overly familiar address to a superior, or failure to observe the proper interval before rising from an assembly could transform a promising connection into one marked by avoidance, with hosts sometimes confiding in trusted correspondence about the need to curtail future visits to preserve the house's reputation for harmonious gatherings. Historians exploring these incidents emphasize that consequences rarely involved public scandal, but rather the quieter erosion of access, as word of a guest's lapse spread through the same epistolary channels that had facilitated the original invitation, leading to fewer offers from other families attuned to maintaining their own circles. In extreme cases, a guest who overstayed a welcome or disregarded signals about departure times might find their name omitted from lists altogether, prompting reflections in personal writings on how a single, misjudged interaction could ripple outward to affect courtship prospects or business associations tied to the same social web. Interpretations of these house party rules vary among scholars, with some viewing them as mechanisms that reinforced class boundaries through everyday performance, while others suggest they occasionally fostered unexpected alliances when guests navigated the expectations with particular grace, turning potential constraints into opportunities for subtle influence. The absence of a single comprehensive manual meant that individuals learned through observation and occasional correction, creating spaces where regional customs or personal relationships allowed for minor deviations that did not always invite censure. Such flexibility, however, demanded even greater attentiveness, as what passed without comment in one household might register as presumption in another, extending the anxieties of correspondence into the embodied experience of prolonged proximity. Over the course of a visit, these accumulated pressures underscored the broader function of Regency etiquette in sustaining social order by rendering every gesture, silence, and timing a potential marker of belonging or exclusion. In this manner, the protocols of country house parties extended the vigilance already required in written exchanges into the realm of lived duration, where the choreography of arrival, routine, and departure ensured that reputation remained under continuous negotiation even amid the apparent leisure of rural retreats. The emotional undercurrents surface in surviving journals that describe both the relief of a visit concluded without incident and the lingering uncertainty when an ambiguous remark or overlooked courtesy left open the possibility of reinterpretation once guests returned to their separate estates. Through these mechanisms, the system preserved its reach across distances and seasons, binding individuals to an interpretive framework whose full implications could seldom be anticipated at the moment of accepting an invitation. The repercussions of missteps within this intricate web of expectations often surfaced not through dramatic confrontations, but through the gradual withdrawal of invitations and the quiet circulation of whispered assessments that reshaped entire social trajectories. Accounts preserved in private journals from the period describe instances where a single, overlooked courtesy, such as failing to acknowledge a superior's precedence during a morning call or allowing a letter to convey unintended familiarity, set in motion a chain of exclusions that isolated individuals from the network sustaining their families' positions. Historians examining these records observe how such lapses rarely remained confined to one household, instead travelling along the same channels of correspondence that had once facilitated connections, prompting others to reassess their own associations lest they inherit the taint of diminished regard. In this way, a family's standing could erode without any public scandal, as potential alliances for marriage or business dissolved into polite distance, leaving those affected to navigate a landscape where former acquaintances offered only the barest civilities. One particularly illustrative case emerges from the reflections of a young woman whose diary entries trace the aftermath of an ill-timed remark during a country house visit, where an inquiry about a host's financial arrangements was perceived as presumptuous intrusion rather than innocent curiosity. The immediate response involved no open rebuke, yet subsequent gatherings saw her name omitted from lists of attendees, and letters from mutual contacts grew noticeably shorter and less frequent. Over time, this isolation extended to her siblings, whose own prospects for advantageous matches diminished as the family's reputation for discretion came into question. Similar patterns appear in other surviving correspondences, where a misplaced glove at an assembly or an overly prolonged glance during a promenade could signal a lack of self-control, inviting interpretations that question the broader judgment of the entire household. The possibility that such judgments rested on incomplete information or personal animosities only heightened the uncertainty, as individuals had little recourse beyond attempting to restore favour through exemplary conduct in future encounters. Redemption, when it occurred at all, demanded prolonged demonstrations of restraint that could span years, often requiring relocation to more distant circles or acceptance of matches that fell short of earlier expectations. Some families sought fresh starts in colonial outposts or provincial towns, where the density of scrutiny was somewhat reduced, allowing time for memories to fade among those who remained in the capital. Yet even these adjustments carried their own costs, as the act of departure itself could be read as confirmation of prior failings, and return visits sometimes reignited old assessments rather than erasing them. Exile in its milder forms might involve voluntary withdrawal from certain seasons or assemblies, preserving dignity through absence while hoping that consistent propriety in reduced circumstances might eventually reopen doors. Diaries from those who pursued such paths frequently record the tentative optimism that accompanied a renewed invitation after months or years of careful observance, alongside the persistent awareness that any future lapse would carry compounded weight from the earlier incident. The psychological dimensions of this system surface repeatedly in personal writings that convey the exhaustion of maintaining perpetual awareness across every interaction. Writers describe the mental rehearsal required before each social occasion, weighing not only one's own words, but also the potential resonances they might hold for unseen observers who could relay impressions through letters or conversations. This vigilance extended into moments of apparent privacy, where the knowledge that servants or fellow guests might note and report an unguarded sigh or an uncomposed expression added layers of self-monitoring that left little room for genuine respite. Over extended periods, such demands appear to have fostered a form of chronic apprehension, with some accounts noting physical manifestations like sleeplessness or diminished appetite that accompanied the fear of irreversible misjudgment. The absence of clear guidelines for recovery only intensified this toll, as individuals weighed the risks of proactive explanations against the possibility that any direct address might further highlight the original error. Interpretations among scholars differ regarding the extent to which these outcomes serve to stabilize or destabilize the social order, with some suggesting that the threat of gradual exclusion encouraged a collective investment in the rules themselves, while others point to instances where resilient families adapted by cultivating alternative circles, less bound by metropolitan standards. The variability of consequences depending on rank, region, and the precise nature of the lapse further complicates any singular narrative, as what might ruin prospects for one individual could be overlooked in another context where personal alliances or regional customs offered protection. Through these mechanisms, the etiquette of the era bound reputation to an ever-present calculus, whose outcomes remained difficult to predict, leaving participants to balance the allure of connection against the ever-present shadow of exclusion. This continuous negotiation of standing naturally raises questions about the underlying purposes that sustained such elaborate safeguards across generations. These questions point toward a deeper architecture of intent behind the etiquette codes, one that extended far beyond mere politeness into the realms of power and preservation. Contemporary observers and later analysts alike have noted how such frameworks emerged in response to the shifting alignments of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, when revolutionary tremors across the Channel prompted those in established positions to fortify their domains through invisible barriers rather than overt fortifications. In this light, the elaborate prescriptions for calls, dances, and correspondences served not only to regulate daily exchanges, but also to articulate a collective stance against the erosion of inherited distinctions, allowing participants to signal allegiance to an older order, even as commercial and industrial currents began to reshape the landscape around them. Accounts from the period, preserved in estate ledgers and reflective essays, frequently portray etiquette as an instrument calibrated to sustain class boundaries amid growing pressures from below. A merchant's family might master the outward forms of address and precedence, yet subtle deviations in timing or phrasing could still mark them as interlopers, their invitations extended only provisionally, and their alliances monitored for signs of overreach. Historians tracing these patterns observe that the rules functioned less as neutral customs than as filters, admitting those whose conduct reaffirmed existing hierarchies while quietly diverting others toward parallel but lesser spheres of influence. The possibility that such mechanisms arose partly from genuine anxieties over social flux, rather than solely from calculated exclusion, leaves room for interpretations that see them as adaptive responses to uncertainty, where the codification of conduct offered a semblance of continuity in an era of expanding print culture and transatlantic exchanges. Etiquette operated in parallel as a form of social control that operated through anticipation and self-regulation rather than direct edict. By embedding expectations so thoroughly into the texture of interaction, the system encouraged individuals to internalize constraints that aligned personal ambition with collective stability. Letters exchanged between provincial families and their metropolitan relatives often reveal the careful weighing of each phrase against potential ripple effects, as writers anticipated how a single sentence might be read by intermediaries who held sway over future opportunities. Scholars examining these correspondences note the absence of any centralized authority enforcing the codes. Instead, enforcement emerged organically through the accumulation of small judgments that accumulated into reputational verdicts. This decentralized quality allowed the rules to adapt across regions, with northern industrial towns sometimes relaxing certain formalities, while southern estates retained stricter observances, yet the underlying principle of measured restraint persisted as a safeguard against the volatility that unchecked familiarity might unleash. At the same time, the structured society fostered by these conventions yielded unexpected benefits that tempered their restrictive character. The predictability of interactions reduced the likelihood of spontaneous conflicts in settings where diverse ranks mingled, such as assembly rooms or shared carriages, creating spaces where conversation could proceed along established lines without constant renegotiation of status. Diaries from the era occasionally record moments of relief when participants followed familiar sequences of greeting and departure, allowing attention to shift toward intellectual exchange or quiet observation rather than the navigation of raw uncertainties. Some interpretations suggest that this scaffolding supported a measure of emotional economy, sparing individuals the exhaustive labor of inventing responses to every encounter, and thereby freeing mental resources for other pursuits, whether literary correspondence or estate management. The variability of these advantages depending on one's position within the hierarchy complicates any uniform assessment, as those near the apex might experience the benefits as enhanced security, while those on the margins encountered them more as narrowing corridors of possibility. Further reflections in surviving journals illuminate how the rules intersected with broader political currents, particularly the need to project an image of internal cohesion during periods of wartime mobilization and post-war readjustment. Families positioned near centers of influence often treated adherence to etiquette as an extension of patriotic duty, their orderly households and measured gatherings serving as microcosms of the stable realm they sought to preserve. This linkage between private conduct and public order appears in reflections that frame lapses not merely as personal failings, but as potential vulnerabilities that external observers might exploit. Yet the extent to which such alignments were consciously cultivated remains open to debate, with some accounts implying organic evolution from earlier courtly traditions, while others point to deliberate refinements introduced through conduct manuals that circulated among the aspiring classes. The maintenance of boundaries through etiquette also intersected with questions of inheritance and alliance, where precise protocols for introductions and withdrawals helped channel marital prospects along lines that consolidated rather than dispersed resources. A well-timed acknowledgement or a correctly phrased refusal could steer negotiations toward outcomes that reinforced existing networks, while deviations risk diluting claims to distinction across generations. Historians considering these dynamics emphasize the role of indirect transmission, as children absorb the nuances through observation rather than explicit instruction, perpetuating the system with minimal overt resistance. The possibility that this transmission occasionally produced creative adaptations, such as regional inflections that softened metropolitan strictures, adds layers of nuance to understandings of how control coexisted with flexibility. Unexpected benefits extended into the realm of collective memory and identity formation, where shared adherence to rules created a reservoir of common reference points that transcended individual households. Participants could invoke these conventions in distant settings, whether colonial outposts or continental travels, to re-establish continuity with the world they had left behind. Personal writings from such contexts sometimes convey the reassurance derived from performing familiar gestures amid unfamiliar surroundings, suggesting that the etiquette system provided portable anchors against dislocation. Interpretations differ on whether these anchors primarily served defensive consolidation or whether they occasionally enabled tentative bridges across divides, as when shared rituals facilitated cautious dialogues between otherwise separated groups. Through these interwoven purposes, the etiquette of the period emerges as a multifaceted response to the tensions of its time, balancing preservation against adaptation in ways that resist singular characterization. The quiet persistence of these frameworks across decades indicates their capacity to address multiple needs simultaneously, from the stabilization of rank to the mitigation of everyday frictions, even as their long-term effects on individual agency and collective imagination continue to unfold in unpredictable directions. Considering the cumulative weight of these interwoven purposes, one is drawn to contemplate the human cost that such elaborate frameworks exacted upon those who navigated them daily, a toll measured not in dramatic ruptures, but in the quiet erosion of spontaneity and the persistent undercurrent of vigilance that shaped each interaction. Individuals found themselves perpetually attuned to the subtlest signals of approval or exclusion, their inner lives compressed into the narrow channels permitted by precedents and phrasing, where a misplaced glance or an ill-timed pause could ripple outward into diminished prospects for alliance or inheritance. Contemporary accounts, though filtered through the decorum they themselves upheld, hint at the exhaustion borne by those on the periphery, merchants aspiring toward acceptance, or daughters whose marital futures hinged upon flawless execution of ritualized exchanges, their ambitions tempered by the knowledge that any deviation might consign them to narrower spheres of influence, without overt acknowledgement of the barrier crossed. The possibility that such constraints fostered a form of internalized restraint, one that aligned personal desires with collective expectations, yet left room for private resentments to simmer beneath polished surfaces, invites interpretations that see the etiquette system as both preservative and depleting, sustaining social order while exacting a subtle tax on emotional reserves and authentic self-expression across generations. In reflecting upon these dynamics from a modern vantage, parallels emerge in the unspoken codes that govern contemporary interactions. From the measured timing of digital replies to the curated presentations of professional networks, where deviations in tone or visibility can similarly mark one as an outlier, though the mechanisms of enforcement have shifted from drawing rooms to algorithmic amplification and instantaneous commentary. Just as Regency participants weighed each phrase against potential ripple effects in letters that might circulate beyond their immediate recipients, Today's equivalents unfold through platforms where a single post or omission invites judgments that accumulate into reputational verdicts, encouraging self-regulation that aligns ambition with prevailing norms while quietly diverting those whose expressions fall outside accepted registers. The adaptive quality of these modern frameworks, relaxing in some digital enclaves while tightening in others according to professional or regional contexts, mirrors the variability noted in earlier eras, suggesting that the impulse towards structured conduct persists as a response to uncertainty, offering continuity amid rapid shifts in communication and social alignment. Yet the lessons that surface from such comparisons underscore the value of recognizing how these architectures, whether historical or current, balance preservation of stability against the narrowing of individual agency, prompting reflection on whether greater transparency and expectations might mitigate the unspoken frictions that persist across time. One might consider, for instance, how the emotional economy once afforded by predictable sequences of greeting and withdrawal finds echoes in the routines of virtual meetings or social media protocols, where established patterns reduce the labor of constant renegotiation, yet can still constrain the emergence of unscripted connections. Diaries and correspondences from the period occasionally reveal moments of quiet relief, when rules were followed without incident, freeing attention for other pursuits, a dynamic that resonates with contemporary experiences of navigating professional hierarchies through familiar courtesies that allow focus to turn toward shared objectives rather than status navigation. At the same time, the decentralized enforcement through accumulated small judgments continues in forms such as subtle exclusions from opportunities or networks, where adherence reaffirms existing alignments while deviations risk provisional acceptance at best. Historians and social observers exploring these continuities note the absence of any single authority dictating the codes, instead observing organic evolution through collective practice, a quality that allowed Regency rules to persist across regions with local inflections, and similarly enables modern variants to adapt without centralized decree. The long-term effects on collective imagination, as these frameworks unfolded in unpredictable directions, further illuminate how etiquette served as a portable anchor against dislocation, whether in colonial settings or continental travels for those in earlier times, or in the globalized yet fragmented interactions of the present where shared digital rituals re-establish continuity amid unfamiliar contexts. Personal reflections preserved from the era convey the reassurance derived from performing familiar gestures, a sentiment that finds contemporary parallels in the comfort some derive from adhering to expected response times or professional pleasantries, even as the underlying principle of measured restraint guards against volatilities that unchecked familiarity might introduce. Interpretations differ on whether these mechanisms primarily consolidate boundaries or occasionally facilitate tentative bridges, as when shared conventions enable cautious dialogues across divides, yet the capacity to address multiple needs simultaneously, from stabilization to the mitigation of everyday uncertainties, remains evident in both historical persistence and ongoing relevance. As we draw these threads together, it becomes clear that the etiquette of the Regency period, with all its rigidities and unexpected affordances, offers a lens through which to examine the enduring human negotiation between structure and freedom, one that continues to shape interactions without asserting singular certainty about its origins or outcomes. The quiet persistence across decades, balancing preservation against adaptation, encourages a measured appreciation for how such systems emerge from anxieties over flux, while yielding spaces for intellectual exchange or quiet observation within their bounds. In our own era, where similar codes operate through anticipation and self-regulation amid expanding networks of connection, the invitation arises to consider what elements of predictability might still serve emotional economy without unduly constraining possibility, fostering dialogues that acknowledge both the relief of familiar sequences and the costs borne by those navigating their margins. Thank you for joining this exploration of the Regency era's intricate social tapestry, and for allowing these reflections to accompany your moments of rest. If the content has resonated with you, we kindly invite you to like this video, share in the comments where you're listening from, and subscribe for more thoughtful journeys into history that unfold at a gentle pace. Your support helps sustain these conversations, and we look forward to welcoming you in future explorations that continue to weave together the past and its echoes in the present.